In this video, we're going to walk through how to use nonverbal communication effectively. And in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is draw a distinction between verbal communication and nonverbal communication. Our verbals simply consist of the words chosen when we communicate, nothing else. Our nonverbal communication, then by definition, is everything else. That includes our appearance, our body language, our eye gaze, something called proxemics, which is just where we stand in relation to other things and people. Even pauses in our vocals and our tone and our volume fall under the nonverbal category, which can be a little bit confusing. Now, there is some debate about how much of our meaning comes from our nonverbal communication, but there is a consensus that it's somewhere between 55% and 93%. Now, that's a pretty wide range, but the main thing I want you to take from that is that we know that our nonverbal communication accounts for more of the message than our verbal communication. And this makes sense because when they contradict each other, we tend to believe someone's nonverbal communication. Think about this. If you were to ask me, hey, Gabe, how are you doing today? And I was like, I'm good. What would you think? You'd be like, hey, Gabe is not okay. So why do we believe the nonverbals over the verbals? This is likely due to a couple different things. Some nonverbal communication is learned, but some of it is also innate. We know that babies cry, laugh, and smile, but it's actually deeper than that. The still face experiment found that babies often match their mom's mood simply by observing her face. The findings show how important it is for a parent to cultivate a peaceful, positive environment for infants. In fact, I would argue that a lot of our intuition comes from innate subconscious observations of nonverbal communication. So we've really talked about how important our nonverbal communication is. Let's walk through some different categories of nonverbal communication and what purpose they actually serve. The first one I want to touch on is called kinesics. These are body movements. When used effectively, they complement the message. So all this that I do with all my hands and the waving, all this is meant to complement the message. And our body movements often show how we're feeling in a situation, and when they're used ineffectively, they usually show nervousness. The next category is called expressions. Right? There are 6 universal expressions: anger, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, and disgust. The fact that these are universal is interesting, and it shows how certain nonverbal communication doesn't depend on culture and upbringing, and instead, like I said before, is actually innate. The third category is called vocalics. Vocalics include our tone, our volume, the rate of our speech, and pauses in our vocals. When we use these effectively, we can draw the listener's attention towards a specific part of the message and maybe even away from a different part of the message. Next, we have our eye gaze. Our eye gaze shows and encourages a high level of engagement between the speaker and the audience, and this is a good thing. Okay? Then we have haptics. Haptics refers to physical touch, right? Hugs, handshakes, things like that. Haptics can be used to make people feel at ease in an interaction and to fulfill cultural norms in general. Then we have proxemics, which I mentioned earlier. This is how we utilize space. Where do we position ourselves in relation to other people and other things in the room? Think about a classroom for a second. Who's at the front of it? Why are they at the front of it? What message does this send and then actually reinforce? If you were to go to a social gathering, who do you stay close to? Probably the people that you know better, right? That expresses some sort of relational closeness. Okay, finally, we have our physical appearance. Your physical appearance sends a message about your credibility on a given subject. We're more likely to believe someone who looks the part, and these biases don't actually just stop there. A study done by Beaver and Bacchio and Smith, done in 2019, found that when all other variables were equal, attractive females were the least likely to be arrested for a crime and the least likely to also be convicted of a crime. This shows just how much our physical appearance actually communicates to others. Another thing our nonverbal communication does is it regulates the conversation. Now, when I say regulates the conversation, I mean it determines both how long the interaction is going to last and what subjects are going to be discussed within that interaction and future interactions. How do you know when a conversation's ending? The pauses get longer, right? We start to kind of look around. Eye contact all of a sudden is a little bit more scarce, right? And then, well, boom, we know the conversation is probably coming to a close. If someone was to bring up a topic that you were not interested in, you probably would be a little bit more silent, and it might send a message to them that you're not interested in that, and they're less likely to bring that up in the future. So let's talk about why nonverbal communication is actually often misinterpreted. This is due to a few different reasons. The first reason is that our nonverbal communication is unique to each individual. That means that I could do something, and then you could do the exact same thing, and it could mean different things, and this makes it a little bit confusing. Nonverbal behaviors also have multiple meanings, which means I could do one thing one time and it means one thing, and then in a different scenario, it means something else. So in this way, our nonverbals actually depend on context. What's context? Well, the circumstances that form the setting for an event. Why is the interaction happening, and why is it happening the way that it's happening? So we need to be aware of the circumstances that are surrounding this interaction in order to effectively interpret someone's nonverbal communication. Our nonverbals are also interdependent, meaning they affect each other. When we stack them together, all of a sudden they have different meanings. For example, if I was interested in someone, I might laugh at all their jokes, right? Now that could mean one of two things. That could just mean that they're funny, right? But all of a sudden, if we stack that with other nonverbal behaviors, we might arrive at the conclusion of, oh, man, Gabe's actually interested in this person, right? So that makes them a little bit confusing as well. So how can we effectively interpret nonverbal communication? Well, the first thing we can do is consider the individual's nonverbal profile. Now, this sounds super difficult, but it's actually pretty simple. A lot of us probably have close friends that we can think of that when we're in a social setting and they shoot us a look, we know exactly what that look means. How? Well, because we've considered the individual's nonverbal profile. We've observed them enough to know that in this context, that look means this specific thing. So in order to consider the individual's nonverbal profile, it's important that you build some sort of relationship with them, which suggests that if you don't know someone very well, you probably shouldn't put too much stock in their nonverbal communication. The next thing we need to do is consider the context for the reason that we talked about before. I could do one thing in one scenario and it might mean one thing, and then in another scenario it might mean something else. So we want to make sure that we take into account why the interaction is happening the way that it's happening. Thirdly, we want to consider what someone's previous nonverbal communication is telling us. Was there a shift in their nonverbal behavior? Because shifts often communicate something has changed in some way. Or did their nonverbal behavior simply remain consistent the whole time? And then finally, we want to not put too much stock in someone's nonverbal communication in general. A lot of times people overanalyze someone's nonverbal behavior, and that can become actually detrimental to effective communication. So the last thing we want to do is we want to balance somebody's nonverbal communication with their verbal communication. Those two things each play a role in making up the entire meaning of the message. Okay? So that's all I have for this video.